Good afternoon, everybody. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Zachary Ring. I'm with Thea Enterprises. This is one of a Thea hosted webinar series where we have Joe from Breakthrough Lighting talking us through lighting design. First part of the series, we focused on the principles of lighting design. This part of the series, we're going to talk about specific applications throughout the house and really breaking down each application. So we'll see some shots of kitchens, dining rooms, bedrooms. We'll talk about the different lightings and the different lighting techniques that we can use in each one of those spaces. And then in part 3 of this series, we're going to talk about how we can insert specific product lines that will be available to you through Thea and when working with Joe into these different applications. So we'll take a look at a cove or an under cabinet or a downlight and then talk about specific products and then how to make money by selling those products and how to better navigate the specification channel. So if you haven't signed up for part 3 yet, make sure you get signed up for that. Thank you so much for joining us. I know we're all on a lot of webinars and a lot of these calls lately, so thanks for taking an hour. We might not even go a full hour today. Maybe we will with Q&A, but we'll get started now. I'm going to hand it over to Joe.
Thanks, Zach, and thanks everybody for carving a little bit of time for us out of your busy schedule. We really appreciate that. So if you were part of the first session, we talked about the general principles of lighting and some of the techniques and things and characteristics that you look for when it comes to lighting fixtures and particularly architectural recessed lighting. So today we're going to talk a little bit more about the why. And hopefully after the webinar is over, you'll be able to walk into any room and understand why certain things may have happened the way that they did and why they're laid out the way that they are in terms of the lighting. So these are the goals. These are the things that we're going to cover. It's a little bit of a busy slide, but these bullet points, we're going to go into dive into each and every one of them. And we're going to be focusing on architectural integration, beginning with a quick overview of lighting hardware, which luminaire platform we're going to use to integrate with the architecture. We're going to select hardware or fixtures that are appropriate to scale in terms of dimension, of architecture and people. Selecting hardware that fits, right, for the decor, for the geometry of the spaces. We're going to look at using light to render architecture. In other words, to be able to highlight structural relationships, we're going to use patterns, rhythms, groupings, and repetitions to do that. We're going to use lighting to render architecture and enhance the understanding of space, how a space is utilized, how the space flows, and transitions and continuations. We're going to talk about how lighting reinforces activities and furnishings within a space. And finally, just a quick slide on things that you should avoid when talking about implementing lighting. So let's get right to it. When it comes to architectural integration, obviously the hardware or the luminaires that you use are very important. So again, you have to figure out, is it new construction? Is it a remodel? Is it a combination where you're adding and then remodeling? And then what type of fixtures you're going to use, right? For instance, are you going to use some pendants? Are you going to utilize linear? Are there going to be any surface mount? Some of the things that you want to consider as you start to evaluate the scope of your job, right? Other things, if you look at the bottom of the slide there, we want to consider which lights are going to be used for indoor, which ones are going to be used for outdoor. You have to consider IP rating in terms of whether this is going to be for damp location or wet location. And there's obviously different ratings for IP. The most common ones that you're going to run into when it comes to lighting is IP20, which is basically that it's just safe to the touch. It doesn't have any protection. It doesn't offer any protection from water or damp locations. And this is true for things like sconces or any type of indoor lighting. IP65 is basically a light that can be in a damp location where maybe there's a little bit of a spray of water that may be put towards the light or something like that. IP67 is for certain applications where you may need the light to be submerged at times, let's say the side of a pool or something like that. And then IP68 is for lights that need to be permanently submerged, like in outdoor water features, pool decks and things along those lines, fountains, for instance, and so on. So these are some of the considerations, right, in terms of lighting hardware. And the whole objective is that when you combine inside with the outside and create those seamless transitions, what you're going to end up with is a very balanced indoor-outdoor appearance when the lights are on. As you can see from this picture, it's very well balanced on both sides as well as the center. We don't have too many lights on the left side or not enough lighting on the center, but it all looks very balanced and uniform. And uniformity is one of the most important things that you're going to be trying to accomplish and pay attention to. So then there's the hardware that is appropriate to scale, right? So we're going to be looking at the geometry and the dimensions of the room in terms of how it relates to people that will be occupying those spaces, right? So we're looking at things like the ceiling height. You see there at the bottom of the slide, right? Is it a high ceiling? Is it a loft? Does it have a slope to it? Is it slanted? What is the reflective characteristics of the ceiling? Those things are going to be very important. The furniture layout is something that you want to pay very close attention to, and any natural light sources that you're going to have, whether it's windows, skylights, things of that nature. All of that needs to be taken into consideration. Just a little bit more about reflectivity and how light interacts with reflective surfaces. As you can see in this particular example, the ceiling doesn't really have any downlights on it. It has indirect lighting, linear lighting around the perimeter. And so this is a very reflective surface, and it does the job in terms of illuminating everything that's on the bottom there below it. And sometimes you can get away with that if you have a highly reflective surface that you're working with. So all these are things that you think about as you start to form an idea of which types of luminaires you're going to be using and how your layout is going to work within the space that you're trying to illuminate. Then, of course, you have to select the hardware that fits, right? Are we going to go with round? Are we going to go with square? Is it flanged or flangeless? Or some people don't use the term flangeless, they use the term trimless, which usually refers to a butt-in fixture. It's a cleaner look. It draws less attention to the luminaire. Is it going to be beveled or flat? Is it going to regress? In the first part of this webinar series, we talked about how regressing an LED, the light source, into the fixture prevents glare. But there's a trade-off, because when you're regressing, you're preventing glare, which is a nice thing because it doesn't draw any attention to the light, but you sacrifice a little bit in lumen output. So these are trade-offs and things that you want to take into consideration. Do you want it to be shallower or deeper? Again, this has to do with the regress. And then taking into consideration the optics, right? Do you want wide beams? Do you want narrow beams? Are you focusing on and highlighting specific areas? And we're going to see how we can utilize all of those tricks in some examples here. But selecting hardware that fits, right? Then the other thing that we want to think about is, what is the decor? So for instance, if you have something that's along the lines of more modern or minimalist, well, then square might be a better option, because minimalist modern design tends to be a little bit cleaner with more straight lines and some cleaner transitions from one room to the other. So square sort of lends itself to that. If it's a little more traditional, you may want to consider round fixtures where there's more texture, where the decor is a little bit heavier. You may want to even implement something like chandeliers or pendants to add to the ambience or the general lighting, in addition to having some round fixtures around the perimeter or something along those lines, depending on what the objective is and what it is that you're trying to highlight. So decor is also very important when selecting hardware that fits. It's not just the shapes, the form and function, but also how the aesthetics, how it relates to aesthetics and how it's going to look. And then lighting needs to highlight the features of the architecture, right? So for instance, in this case, we have this beautiful coffer ceiling, and they went through to create a lot of detail with the trims and everything like that. And it would be a shame to just fill it up with holes and put a whole bunch of downlights in there. So you look for creative ways to highlight those features without being so intrusive, right? So in this particular case, a cove was created around the perimeter of that coffer ceiling to highlight the texture that it brings, the personality that it brings to the room, complementing it with a nice chandelier there. And as you can see in the background, we've used some sconces, there's some art lights, and it all adds to the depth and in relation to how people are going to react. And so these are situations where using a little bit of repetition, using different patterns will create a rhythm, a sequence, a transition to the lighting to highlight all these specific areas of a room. Here's the reason why patterns are important within lighting design, because they reinforce circulation and they reinforce features, right? By circulation, what we mean is the way that the light interacts in that space and the way that the light interacts as you move from one space to another space, right? They introduce strong visual attachment and appeal. The eye will go wherever the light is. So whatever is the most illuminated in that space, that's where your eyes are going to be drawn to. That's where the attention is going to be. So you have to select very carefully which things are going to be brighter, which are going to be a little bit dimmer, and why that is that you're going to highlight those other things. So introducing strong visual attachment and appeal, and then breaking up what would otherwise be a monotonous application, right? It's just a plain room. Now the room feels more like it has an ambience where you can relax, or maybe it's an ambience where you can get busy and do work, or maybe it's an ambience where you just want a little bit of privacy, and you can create all these different vibes with the lighting. Here's an example of patterns. You see there's plenty of natural light coming in from the windows, but then you have a grouping of linear lights directly above the furniture. And that is to highlight that area, to make it inviting so that people can go there and stimulate a little bit of conversation and congregating together. Then you have on the side that kind of gives that a floating feeling, a floating ceiling aspect or feel to it. But it also compartmentalizes that space so that it feels like it's there on its own, separate from the rest of this, from other spaces within that room. It's a fairly large room. So you feel like you're stepping into a different zone, right? And so by doing groupings, by doing repetitions within a lighting layout, you can accomplish these things and isolate or highlight different rooms, furnishings, different aspects or characteristics that you want to draw people's attention to within that space. So one of the biggest weapons that we have, or tools that we have at our disposal when we're trying to create these spaces, is coves. Coves are very important. They come in shapes and sizes. They can be horizontal, they can be vertical, they can be zigzagged, they can be as thin as just a few centimeters, or they can be as wide as a few inches, depending on the application. But these are some of the things that you can accomplish with coves. You can reinforce elegance and the modern aspect of sweeping architectural forms. Again, you may have different levels of ceilings, and by adding a little bit of a cove, you can highlight areas that could otherwise be missed as the occupants walk by it. You can emphasize colors, textures on walls, determine or differentiate the planar intersections where ceiling planes step up or down from each other, like I just mentioned. You can highlight functions between walls or junctions between walls and ceilings if you have special features, and you can assist in assessing space and depth and form. And number 5 is particularly important in some cases when there's, let's say, older occupants. As you age, the amount of light that the iris of the eye can capture starts to diminish, things to be a little bit brighter. And as with the same going along the lines of needing things to be a little bit brighter, you need to create a little more depth of perception of the space so that people don't get disoriented, and there's not too much glare and things of that nature. So all of that has to be taken into consideration. So one of the components that we use when we create Coves is LED strip. So people call it LED rope, or they call it LED tape. But we're going to highlight some characteristics for you that are very important when considering the type of LED strip or LED tape that you're going to use to create these Coves, right? And the first one is the LED strip itself. So a couple of things here. You want to make sure that it has a high CRI, color rendering index. The highest you can go is 100. So anything on the 90 plus side is very good, because what it will do is it'll do an excellent job as far as bringing the natural colors of texture or whatever it is that you're illuminating directly under the light. You want to pay attention to the wattage per foot and the number of lumens per foot, because that is going to determine how bright the area is going to be, how much dimming you're going to have to do, and it's also going to tell you a lot about the type of drivers, the electronics that you're going to be using to power these elements, right? Another thing that's very important is the cuttable. This, if you can see my arrow here, how the intervals at which you can cut the LED to adjust it in the field to size. Maybe you have an odd size run and you just need to cut it in the field and customize it to that particular area. So the shorter the interval is, the more flexibility that you have in terms of how big or how short you can make it. In this particular case here is every 1 inch. Most LED strip out there is between 1 and 2 inches. So you should be okay. Stay away from 3 or more, because then you're not going to have as much flexibility when you do that. The spacing of the LEDs is very important. The spacing of the LEDs in many cases will dictate brightness, but it will also dictate whether you're going to have to worry about things like little dots or spots on the channel after you install the LED, and we'll go into that a little bit more here. And then obviously, you're going to want to make sure that it's either UL or ETL listed, so that it's been properly tested. Sometimes LED gets a little bit finicky. We don't want to have to going back and replacing LED strips. And then is it going to be for the indoors or outdoors? And we need it to be water resistant, then we're definitely going to be paying attention to those things. So again, just to recap, right at the bottom of the slide here, you see here, you're going to be looking at things like color, whether it's monochrome, a warm light, a cooler light, those things, or RGB, where it's multicolor or color changing, or even tunable white in some cases, right? You're going to pay attention to the width of the LED strip to make sure that it fits inside the channel that it's been specified to create that effect or that cove. Wattage, as we mentioned, is very important. Wattage is important because of the drivers. And then because everything is remote with the drivers, you want to make sure that the location is already clear as to where the driver is going to go. And make sure you're taking into consideration the distance, how far the driver is from where the LED strip is going to be, because this is where wire gauge comes into consideration. The higher the number on the wire gauge, the thinner the wire is. The thinner the wire is, the less current or the higher voltage drop that you're going to have on current as you travel longer distances. So you want to make sure that you select the correct wire gauge. In most cases, 18 gauge is fine. But if you're looking at distances of 20, 30, in some cases 40, 50 feet, you want to go with a lower gauge, maybe somewhere between 14 and 12. And this is the copper strand class 2 low voltage wire, right? So these are some of the things you want to take into consideration. Again, not all LED strip is created equal. And in the third class, the next round of webinars, we're going to go into a lot of detail as far as the choices that you can get through Thea Enterprises and their partners in terms of which LEDs you can use. Then there's, of course, the channel. And some of the things that you're going to be looking and paying attention to is the depth of the channel and the lens type that you're going to use in the channel, right? Why is depth important? Well, it's important because the moment you put the LED strip inside the channel, the output is minimized. You lose the lumen output, right? Some spec sheets will tell you what the lumen output is of the LED strip, and then the deliver lumen output after it's put in the channel. So those are things that you want to pay attention to. Usually on average is about a reduction of about 15 to 20% brightness when it goes into the channel, depending on the type of lens that you use, right? So channels come in many different shapes and sizes. You're going to have surface mount with different types of depth, different widths, depending on the application. There's some that are recessed. They're recessed with little wings so that it doesn't go all the way through into the channel that you prepare for the linear strip. And then there's others that are a little bit more seamless, right, and trimless, they call them. So different types of channels. The lens is also very important. You can either have it clear, you can have it frosted, or you can have it semi-frosted. Again, it all depends on to what extent you need to minimize those little dots that you usually get when you work with LED strips. In this particular case, as you can see, the ideal situation is to have a smooth, consistent, uniform light all the way across, as we see on the picture on the right there, no dots. Again, some of the things that you want to take into consideration. Whenever you're talking to your suppliers, you should be having these conversations. And in general, they'll probably bring them up and talk about these things and ask you these questions. But in case that they don't, then you should be asking these questions or at least getting a little bit of guidance and direction from them. Here's another style of linear channel extrusion. This is a 45-degree, and like I said, there's many, many different types for different applications, both for indoor and outdoor. And again, this is to create those coves that can do so many things to bring a place alive, right? So here's an example of how we've used all these different components that we've been talking about, right? So we have under cabinet lighting, sort of highlighting that area of the kitchen, of the room. Then you have some downlights shining over the counter. It sort of becomes the focal point of the room at that moment if it's left with that scene right there, and it enables people to come in and it's inviting. And then you have a pendant to the side on the dining table, sort of separating. It's almost like if you go from the bar area, from the counter area, you're stepping into a different zone or a different area by providing the lighting this way. Another quick note with regards to using a combination of downlights and under cabinet lighting is that you want to pay attention to the color temperature of the light. Almost in every single case, you're going to want to match it. So if you're using 3000 Kelvin on your downlights, make sure you're using 3000 Kelvin on your under cabinet lighting so that you don't have that strange contrast when the lights are turned on together. The other thing that you want to, and just one more thing about that is if you have tunable fixtures, then you don't have to worry about that. So if you're using something like Ketra, where you can easily match whatever color the under cabinet is, then you should be okay there. And again, those are things that we're going to get into in greater detail in the third lesson that we're going to have. And then the other thing is zones, right? Do you want them to always come on together? Do you want them to come on separately? Then you're going to have to plan for zones. With regards to coves, with regards to under cabinet lighting, any type of linear lighting, every time you designate a zone that is going to be controlled independently of all the others in terms of dimming and when it comes on and when it comes off, you are going to need to have a separate driver for each one of those, unless you have addressable drivers. But even in that case, you'll have to have an independent driver for each zone. So those are some of the things to keep in mind. Here's another example of how light can be used to render architecture and enhance understanding of space. In this case, we have this beautiful plank wall, planks of marble, And so we are highlighting those by grazing that wall with a cove right above it. And it highlights all the characteristics, all the marbling of each plank to highlight those features. And you notice that even in the shelf in the background there, we used a little bit of linear lighting to highlight one specific area and draw a little bit of attention, and it just gives it a sense of depth and a sense of separation, so you can kind of appreciate all the different features in this particular room. In this case right here, again, we're accentuating different aspects. The paneling in the back all of a sudden takes on a completely different personality by taking advantage of the natural lighting, but also taking advantage directly behind the couch and some coves on to the side to not only create the depth, but also to highlight the texture, the grain, the wood grain of those doors that you see there. So again, we're helping people as they occupy these spaces to understand the space and how it should be utilized. Here's an example of different levels of ceiling, creating those effects. If you're not lighting them, in many cases, it may not, the effect is not going to be as drastic. And in fact, if they're entertaining, people come over and they're not used to seeing those type of features or details, they may overlook them altogether. So by putting a little bit of light, you sort of draw attention to those things to again create those separations and highlight different architectural features. And of course, as we look at lighting, some of the things that you don't want to do is have a whole bunch of visual noise by not taking into consideration what the purpose of the room is, how people are going to utilize the space, and what type of hardware of fixtures you should be using. Applying certain disciplines when it comes to spacing, when it comes to the way that you align them on the grid, when you're creating those layouts and so forth, right? And then there's the other side of the spectrum is the visual clutter, where if you have way too many lights in way too many random areas, it's difficult to get a sense of the flow, the orientation, the depth, or the transition or direction in which you should be going in or utilizing the space as you're walking through it. So something to keep in mind. So in the end, what you want to have, as I mentioned at the offset, is a well-balanced environment, a well-balanced space where things can be inviting, where the eye can be drawn to those features based on how they are lit, right? So we have some very nice pendants right over the table there. We're taking advantage of some of the natural light over the furniture, and we're also using some what you would consider I lost my train of thought with the word here, but anyway, some accent lighting for the steps and so on. So as you can see, well balanced, and this is exactly what we're looking for in the end. Then if you take care of all those things, then you'll be able to provide and deliver a very satisfying experience for your subjects, for your owners, right? And the three main things that people look for when they enter any space is are highlighted right here. So subjective impressions is they want to know how the space is going to be used, right? Is it going to be used for relaxation? Is it for privacy? Do you want to get a sense of spaciousness? And this is what happens anytime you walk into a space and it just feels right, but you don't necessarily know why. So you just think, you know, that restaurant, you know, that's a good vibe there. I really like that restaurant. Well, 9 out of 10 times, one of the reasons why that restaurant feels so good is because the lighting was done correctly, right? And your subjective impression was one that it just had a very nice feel to it. Well, the light helps to create that feeling. And then obviously behavior, how you're going to use, how you're going to move within the space, the orientation, the depth, so that people know exactly where to look and why certain features are where they are. And of course, the perception, which has to do with visual clarity. Is it a place that encourages gathering and conversation? Is it a place that encourages work and a time to be focused? Or is it a place that where you can have, again, relaxation and so on? So the perception is very important. We call that the psychological and biological considerations. So if you apply all the other things that we just discussed, then you will be able to deliver on this aspect. So one other question is, so how do you bring all this together, and how do you know that it's going to work, and how do you determine whether it is going to create the effect that you want it to create? Well, that's where the lighting design comes into play, where you can hire a professional to basically do a process of calculations for you, so that you can make sure that this is going to be the case, that the light is going to perform exactly the way that it was intended to before you even begin to install. And the way that we do that is through a series of consultations, right? So the first thing that we do is we create a rough layout just in basic consultation with the client or with the contractor, the builder, the interior designer, whoever it might be. And we get a general idea of how things are going to be laid out, what features are important, and then how they're going to be highlighted, right? Then we create a simple professional layout. We start working on zones and how the lights are going to come on, what areas are going to be controlled independently, and so forth. We start to formulate fixture counts, as you can see at the bottom there, and what type of lighting is going to be used. Once there's a general agreement as far as how that's going to take place, we start doing photometry calculations, right? And this is to determine the optics, how the optics are going to perform, and how much light they're going to deliver to different surfaces, right? Whether you have working areas, whether you have counters, desks, simply just furniture, or just empty space where you just want to make sure that the floor is properly lit and people are not bumping into things. Then we do a false color rendering, right? And this is to help people visualize what the eye sees. Now we see a very small spectrum of the light gamut, and this helps to see where the brighter areas will be. It helps identify some darker areas, and we measure this through foot candles. And then there's different rules for how many foot candles should be delivered for different surfaces, and also whether taking into consideration whether this is a commercial space or a residential space. Then we do another run to let the client know where some of the dark areas might be, where we may need to do a little bit of additional work. And eventually what you want to have, again, as I mentioned before at the offset, is a very balanced lighting configuration where every space has been thought of and taken into consideration. So hopefully by looking at these slides, again, you will be able to walk into a space and sort of get a good feel for what the designer was trying to do. Or when your customer starts to talk to you about certain features that are important to them, you'll have a few tools or certain things that you will be able to bring up and talk about. And then when things get a little more complex and you need some quick assistance, we're just a phone call away, and we can certainly guide you through some of these things. It doesn't matter if it's a small job, a big job, simple job, complex job, remodel, new construction. No job is too small or too big or too complex. We can certainly be there to help you walk through it and plug in some of these services. And again, in the third round of webinars, we're going to get a little bit more into how you can leverage that to create more revenue channels for yourself from a designing standpoint, bringing all this expertise, differentiating yourself with your clients, deepening those relationships, and of course the revenue by being able to take control of the fixtures and sell the fixtures yourself. So that is the end of our presentation, and we'll turn it over to Zach now.
All right, thanks a bunch, Joe. And if you have any questions for Joe, you can go ahead and throw them into the questions box now. And if you're interested in working with Breakthrough in the future, the info's here, but there's also just a 1-question survey at the end. So if you indicate yes, Joe can also reach out to you that way as well. So just when you close this down, answer yes, and then Joe can share his contact information with you via email. Sign up for part 3. It's really what kind of closes the loop on this whole process and allows us to get to the extra revenue that we're all looking for. So we'll hang out for a couple seconds if anybody has any questions. Otherwise, thanks so much for joining us, and we'll see you next time.
Thanks, everybody.
All right, Joe, looks like we're good on questions. Thanks again.
Thank you.